Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to do another one of these sort of short videos on the openings of books. And this one is from Clive Barker's The Thief of Always. And the reason I want to talk about this, before I remember in a video, I was talking about how an author or a writer or a storyteller can take very mundane events and then, through the use of their language, turn those mundane events into something fantastic. And I was talking to a friend of mine about this, Dr. Daniel Craig, and he had said, "Oh, you should look at The Thief of Always and how it opens because it has a great opening." And he was exactly right. I'd completely forgotten about this. So again, I'll go through this very, very quickly. I'm not going to pick up every single aspect of this, but I want to try and point out a couple of key points here. And the main one that I want you to be hopefully thinking about as we go through this is, how much does this opening tell us about the character of Harvey Swick? What does it help us create in our mind about him and his environment and his stage of life? And also, how Barker has used the language here to turn something incredibly mundane into something grand, or at least grandiose. Um, and you'll see what I mean when we go through this. The great grey beast February had eaten Harvey Swick alive. Here he was, buried in the belly of that smothering month, wondering if he would ever find his way out through the cold coils that lay between here and Easter. He didn't think much of his chances. More than likely, he'd become so bored as the hours crawled by that one day he'd simply forget to breathe. Then maybe people would get to wondering why such a fine young lad had perished in his prime. It would become a celebrated mystery, which wouldn't be solved until some great detective decided to recreate a day in Harvey's life. Then, and only then, would the grim truth be discovered. The detective would first follow Harvey's route to school every morning, trekking through the dismal streets. Then he'd sit at Harvey's desk and listen to the pitiful drone of the history teacher and the science teacher, and wonder how the heroic boy had managed to keep his eyes open. And finally, as the wasted day dwindled to dusk, he'd trace the homeward trek, and he'd set foot on the step from which he had departed that morning, and people asked him, as they would, why such a sweet soul as Harvey had died. He would shake his head and say, "It's very simple." "Oh," the curious crowd would say, "do tell." And, brushing away a tear, the detective would reply, "Harvey Swick was eaten by the great grey beast February." So, there is so much humor in this, but not humor in the way that the author is telling us a joke. I'm sure you can tell from not only how I read it, but like how it is written, that this is a young boy, school age, walks to school. It's set during February, and he hates going to school. He hates the walk to school. He hates the fact it's no longer Christmas and it's going to be ages until Easter, and every single day he has to go to school. It's this melodramatic, "oh, woe is me" attitude. And it is so wonderfully evocative. We get a sense of how imaginative and dramatic, or if not melodramatic, Harvey is. He imagines February, this quite grey and dismal month, but as a giant grey beast that has swallowed him up and he can't escape. And all of the alliteration, the constant use of alliteration all the way through this. One of my favorite parts is, "and the wasted day dwindled to dusk," as he'd trace the homeward trek. And it's all of that alliteration all the way through that gives you a sense of, like, Harvey is daydreaming and conjuring this rich, imaginative, ludicrous, epic scenario in his mind as a way to keep himself entertained. And he doesn't want to be in school, and he doesn't want to listen to the science teacher or the history teacher that have pitiful drones and are wasting his day with all of that, education and learning about stuff. He wants to spend the day doing other things. And yet, so much of that is vivid because of the language. I previously had given the example that if you took a plot point, depending on how you wrote it, if you took that narrative event, depending on how you wrote it, you could create radically different narratives. And a shoemaker killing six flies with a flash of his belt, if you dress that up in epic language, it makes it grandiose. And that's the was it the shoemaker and the flies? There's actually a whole fairy tale about that. It might have been seven with one blow. Or you could tell it in very mundane details. And when we think of the mundane details here, what is actually happening in this story? Harvey's bored and he is thinking about how he is spending his weekdays. Not every day, because this doesn't apply to the weekends, but he gets up in the morning and he walks to school, and it is grey and dim and dismal because it's February. And if you live in the northern climes, February is a grey and dark and dismal month because the sun doesn't rise until quite late. And then he goes and he sits in school, and those few daylight hours that we have are wasted because he's trapped in school listening to stuff he doesn't want to think about. And then as he walks home, the sun sets. And again, my friend Dan, when we were talking about this, he'd actually come over to visit, and he suddenly realized the truth of it gets dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And you go, yeah, the days are getting slightly longer, so it's getting dark at about 4 now. It was getting dark earlier. And you can see how that sort of corresponds to the experience here, because Dan's from a part of the world where no, it doesn't get dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It never gets dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so walking home from school, it would still be quite bright. But here, I have distinct memories as a school child. Getting up when it was dark, getting on the school bus when it was dark, getting off the school bus and it was still dark, and going to school. And then coming out of school and walking down and getting on the school bus and it was dark, and going home in the dark and arriving in the dark. The only daylight hours I was trapped in school. I have those memories. I can identify so much with Harvey's perspective here. And it is wonderfully evocative. And so much of this is caught up in the alliteration, in the exaggeration here. The great grey beast, February, had eaten Harvey Swick alive. Grandiose definitely is a word that springs to mind, but buried in the belly of that smothering month. So even if you took that first sentence, the great grey beast February had eaten Harvey Swick alive, and you didn't know what type of story that was, this could have been an actual beast that is coloured grey and whose name happened to be February. Staggering coincidence, but that could be what has just happened. However, here, immediately in the second line, we have confirmation, no, it's the month. And Harvey is imagining this, because we go from Harvey Swick being named in the first sentence, there's this name, and then the second, wondering if he would ever find his way out. So we get point of view confirmed, we know the name of the character, and we get a sense of his imagination because he has turned February into a monster. And so much of it then is relayed in that slightly, no, I wouldn't say overwrought, because this is a very deliberate choice about this to evoke that sense of the childish exaggeration. And a more pared down form of language would not get that across in the same way. You could have had a more matter of fact telling of this. Harvey imagined that February was a big grey beast that was devouring him. Doesn't have the same ring to it. It doesn't tell you or show you as much of who Harvey is. It would get across the same information, but it lacks that engagement. It lacks that color. It lacks that texture. And it lacks that revelation of Harvey's inner life. And that's one of the great things about choice of language. When you have something like this that is heavily focalized, that is all about how the character thinks and how the character perceives the world and what the character is doing, the use of language can communicate so much about that point of view when it is describing something else. So Harvey tells you nothing really about himself. He does mention that he was a boy in his prime, as if a schoolboy is the prime of life, and not, when you're in your early 20s and fully grown, and or in your 30s and you're potentially more mature, or when you're 40 and you're meant to be mature. I'm still waiting on that. But he doesn't directly tell us about himself. He shows us by creating this whole scenario that only a great detective would be able to piece together this very complex mystery about how he would someday vanish. And yeah, you'd have to hire Sherlock Holmes to figure out why a kid was bored in February in between two school holidays. Yeah, Sherlock Holmes is going to be taxed on this one. But this is how Harvey perceives it. It's about how big this problem is, that, and on and on. And this is such a wonderful opening because of that rich texture, the use of the alliteration, the use of exaggeration and hyperbola, the imagination inherent in it, and the fact that Harvey is clearly making stuff up, and it is clearly a very biased version or perspective of what is going on in his life. And he is overestimating how important and how amazing he is. And none of that is in what happens. None of that is even actually in what Harvey tells you about himself. It's all about what you are told and how it is being told to us. So, like I said, I wanted to keep these relatively short, and there's lots more to talk about with this opening. But I think you can see how arresting it is. And without getting into what happens in the rest of the book, it is it's a fable, ostensibly for all ages. So a fairy story. And it's good. It's intended to be able to be read by younger people, but it still works when you're an adult. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.